Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today in this continuation of our Bold Start talks with people we think will bring their expertise into the portfolio to help all of us. If we haven't met before, I'm Ellen. I joined just a couple weeks ago as founder in residence, but I originally got to know the portfolio and Bold Start through the other side as a founder within the family. And I am thrilled to have Adam DuVander here with us today. Adam has been a journalist. He has worked in-house at developer-focused companies like Zapier and SendGrid, and now he spends all of his time consulting on developer content and strategy, and is going to share a bunch of that with us today. So
yeah, good to be here.
Yeah. Since that was a pretty high-level overview, why don't you tell us a little bit about your personal story and how you've made these really interesting career choices?
Yeah, well, I'm a former developer who then kind of moved into communicating about development. And really the path through journalism was on that thread as well. I was the first editor of Programmable Web, which is a directory of APIs. And that's really where I saw a lot of the problems that developer-facing companies have with communicating with developers and sort of having to tell that story, which is what led to starting Every Developer, which is where I work with great dev-focused companies to help them do that. And yeah, I'm excited to dig in here and hear some of the other experiences.
Yeah. And for everyone who's here, if you want to just drop questions in the chat as we go, either I'll pull them in if they're where we're at in the conversation, or we'll also save about 15 minutes at the end to kind of get into anything that people also want to talk about. So Adam, I guess in your own words, developer experience means a lot of different things to different people. So can you give us an idea of what the big components are?
Yeah, so I like to go back kind of so it comes from user experience, and Don Norman's definition of that is something like all of the interactions a user has with a product. And so I think of developer experiences as that broad. So replace user with developer. So it's all the interactions, which means that it really does, to me, start before they even have discovered you. It's kind of it starts with that first discovery, the word of mouth, how other developers are talking about you. You can engineer some of that through maybe top of funnel content, which is I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit about. But then goes through kind of that first experience, which I think is a lot of times what people think of with developer experience. And that's really important, like how someone first is able to make their way through your site and through your documentation. And then I think the piece that some people forget is then all of the stuff that happens after that. So, just because you've had that one first success, that doesn't mean that you've been fully successful with the product. And then, of course, people who have been using an API for 5 years still have interactions with it, right? Like every time they have to go update code, every time they have a reason to look back at the reference to check something, that's still developer experience. So I think it's a pretty broad definition in my mind. That's kind of why I start there when talking about dev content, which isn't necessarily, there's pieces of dev content that most people might not think of as within developer experience. But to me, that's sort of the foundational place that you have to start.
Yeah, I guess to pick up on that, if people are supposed to start there and that's what you work with people on doing, what does that pragmatically look like when you're working with a company? What is that first thing you do to get started on a DevX and content program?
Yeah. Specifically in the work that I do, I look at these 13 criteria that I had put together, many years ago, of what sort of best practices look like, and kind of dig into each of those, things that you wouldn't be surprised to hear like getting started guides and use cases and having language specific approaches so that you are talking to a Python developer with Python examples. If you have the ability to be able to pull in those pieces that someone is looking for. So and I start there even when I'm talking about content, which, I mean, a lot of the work that I help companies do is really that top of funnel kind of content that we talked about. The first thing a developer will discover, how they'll discover you, which in a way is kind of different from this developer experience, but at least in the experience that we classically think of as the docs and that onboarding experience. But to me, again, that's foundational, because if you're going to go and try to get a bunch of developers to find you, you want them to have something that is a solid foundation to stand on. You don't want them to kind of fall on their face. And so, yeah, to me, it starts with that, and being able to find those spots so you can kind of streamline that journey. And yeah, early on, it's like, how can I get someone from they found me to like making some kind of call? Yeah. But yeah, I think that's the basics that you want to get to be able to have more developers find you. But then there are definitely steps beyond that where it's, how can I get someone deeper into this tool, this API? To be able to get that. I make a comparison to piano in a talk where it's like the hello world is maybe like finding middle C, or like playing maybe a C scale, but that's a long ways away from playing a full song, which is kind of what you want them to be able to do. And that takes a different kind of content, different kind of approach for that stuff.
Okay. So I guess let's break that up a little bit. And since you mentioned the top of the funnel content first, how do you think about top of the funnel content in particular?
Yeah. So for there, it goes back to, have you identified sort of use cases, ways that you think someone's going to use your tool? So, when I was at Programmable Web, I mentioned earlier that I would see how people approach their new APIs. And so often it was very inwardly focused. It was like, we've got this new API, and it was really disconnected from what someone would actually do with it. What will they achieve? What's the actual goal that a developer would have when using it? And this, I think part of this is back of the time that it was where APIs were much more of a like put it out and let 1,000 flowers bloom approach. And they would say like, I don't want to pull back the creativity that someone could use. They can do anything with this API. And I think it's important to be able to say, okay, like let's give just a few examples. Let's seed that creativity with something. And so that starts with those use cases, which are going to be things that you can build upon for that top of funnel content too, because use cases really get at what are the problems that a developer has. Like, what else will they be looking for when they find you? Because they're probably not going to be looking specifically for you or specifically for the way that you describe your product. Though the better you get at that, certainly the closer that will be, right? So the top of funnel content is really digging at those use cases and those problems from as many different angles as you can. So, is it a language specific angle so that you're really going after someone who's looking for that problem in Python or JavaScript? Or is it an industry specific problem? Like, what are the different ways that you can approach the same problem, and be able to find the areas where developers discover you, and it really kind of resonates in that way that you're then able to double down on that.
It sounds
on
like
that approach.
Really focusing on the problems the developer might be having rather than starting from the feature where it fits in with what you're doing.
Yeah.
Kind of taking that external approach.
Yeah, and that was really the what got me from the journalistic side to the provider side. Also, was I felt like I had to tell that story at Programmable Web. That was my job, was to determine what's the meaning behind this thing that someone is announcing. And I felt like, well, that should really be their job, right? Like everyone on this call, I assume that you're at a dev focused company, or, have some role there. And that's really that's our job as the people who need to communicate what these tools do, to find that story. Maybe that story gets pitched to press, but it also should be front and center in everything you do, and definitely in your documentation and in your developer blog posts, articles, guides that you publish.
And once you start building that out, how do you tell if it's working? Is there like a good way to measure the impact each post is having? Is there a good way to know if you've been successful? How do you think about that?
Yeah, and I don't consider myself an SEO expert, but I definitely do start with looking at keywords to make sure that you're actually speaking in the language that someone would use to look for the problem that you solve. And so as far as a metric, like before you even get started, are we going after something that seems like there's some interest? And certainly keywords are one spot. There's also kind of just your knowledge of the space. Like, what are some problems that you're noticing people talking about? And then if you've chosen something good, then you should start to see, as for a first metric would be, are people even showing up to this? Is traffic coming in? Are people resonating with it when we put it in emails or on Twitter? But yeah, really the start is page views, really. And that might be that I come from that journalistic background where that's sort of the win, but that's where you can start to see whether there's some traction there. And then the next step from that is, are these problems that are clearly you're hitting a nerve? If people are finding it and arriving at it and staying, that would be another thing to look for, is do they even go on from one article to another that might be connected, right? And then of course, like what you want is for them to sign up or take some action that in marketing terms would turn them into a lead. In dev terms would be someone to be able to interact with in the community, right? They've taken another level of engagement. They kind of joined in that way. And you can start to see you might have some posts that get people there, but don't kind of take that next step. And you can usually sniff out what that would be. Like if there's a really clear, like this solves a problem, and there's like, it makes sense to have a call to action that says create an account and try this yourself. And that is done in a way that is authentic and doesn't feel markety and kind of false. Then those will start to do better, and then you can try to find ways to capture that. But I've definitely learned that it takes a little bit of trial and error, because that's, I mean, some of the things, especially back in programmable web days, the the stuff that would get traction would always surprise me. And so
can you give an example of something that either you thought was going to do great and then didn't get any traction, or the reverse, where you're kind of like, I will just try it and see how it goes, and then it was awesome?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit in between those. Is the biggest post I ever had on programmable web. This will date it a little bit because it was related to Parse, which was the backend as a service that eventually sold to Facebook. And at that time, I could read like tweets that had API in them and read pretty much all of them in a day. I'm not sure that I could do that today, but and there was one that someone mentioned about applying via API. So for Parse, you could apply for a job by sending an API request, and they had like a little spot with not much documentation. I think on purpose, they were trying to get engineers, so it was like, figure this out on your own. And I was writing a roundup of sort of API news of the day, and I thought that one feels like it could be beyond the roundup, but I didn't want to dive too deep into it, so I put it out as its own individual post. But then it went on Hacker News and got shared around on Twitter, and went much bigger than I would have anticipated. I guess I had some inkling because I put it in its own post, but definitely was bigger than I thought, and ended up doing a follow-up with one of the founders that kind of said like, wow, we felt like everyone was talking about us that day because of that. And I think if there's a takeaway for this group that's here on this call, it's finding that way to be able to do something just a little bit different. It was very much in line with their tool, which was creating APIs for mobile backends, and and finding a way to be able to have something that's just a little tweak on kind of the approach that you might see elsewhere. And I think you can do that in your content. So we've talked about like how the content gets attention from a search keyword standpoint, but then I think a really important part that is often forgotten is kind of a point of view. And so really Parse's page, I mean, that was a point of view. It's like, APIs are important, and so we're going to give you a chance to apply through that. And that kind of took that point of view and put it into just that one page, that then your point of view should be across all of the content that you create. And and I think that's often forgotten in the chase for keywords, is that I mean, companies are built on points of view. I mean, you see an opportunity and you go for it with that. Other people are not doing it the way you think it should be done, and that's why you build your company the way you do. And that point of view should be something that flows through the content that you create. And I think that's sometimes missing, or when people feel like they're producing content and it's not resonating, I think that's some of the stuff that's missing. And being willing to take that step to maybe, it's, you don't have to be like super provocative TMZ style, right? Like but to take that little step toward standing out and doing that with that point of view is a way to do it. Yeah.
To have the point of view on the problem that your target user is having.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess you mentioned a few in there around SEO, and then you briefly mentioned Hacker News and Twitter. How do you think about distribution strategy around those content plans? Is there kind of a hit list that everyone should do, or should every company be targeting a different set?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is audience and really understanding that. And even going so far as to question whether it is a developer audience. And that's something that I have been doing a lot more lately with clients and potential clients, is really kind of pushing on that. And sometimes when you're early, you're not totally sure yet who the perfect audience is. But I encourage people to think of, we've talked about developer focused, and I think we're all kind of on the same page there. A developer discovers you, a developer loves you, they use you, they promote you, they bring you to their next job, right? That's a developer focused kind of tool. Then there are those that are developer enabled, where a developer is super heavily involved. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about, the foundational developer experience, having great docs, being able to understand those use cases and describe them, those are all still important. But there's also another, there's the coworker of the developer who might do the discovering, and that then becomes a very different channel for how you would reach that person. So when you're going and promoting something, it wouldn't make sense to use some of those places that you've described, because it might be a business problem that you're solving. I think you can see in some of the big developer company names some of these moves already. Like, I think Twilio and their move to a communications platform is, developers are still hugely important to Twilio. I think developers, they are developer focused, but in their move to maybe more low code kind of tooling, they are trying to expand beyond that, and they're recognizing that there are some members of their audience that are not going to be developers in the I write code every day sense, right? Like, that doesn't mean they might still be capable of writing code. They might still consider themselves technical, but but being able to expand beyond that. And I think there have been more of kind of a move in that direction. Certainly, you mentioned I was at Zapier for 2 years. I've been a long time user of Zapier before I even joined. And Zapier has plenty of developer users, though I was on the platform side. So we're a company with an API. We want our users to be able to access it through Zapier. And so how do we connect our API to Zapier's platform to enable our users? And it turned out there that audience was actually not your classic developer in most cases also.
Who was the audience?
And so there, the audience was product managers and marketers and support, often, because these are all people who want to be able to say yes when someone says, do you integrate with this? And so anyone who wanted to say yes, and really, developers within a SaaS company are not as commonly the ones who are having those conversations with users, where users are saying, I really love your product, but I wish it integrated with these other products I use. And so, that led, I gave a talk at DevRelCon or DevXCon, called Find Your Portal's Invisible Audience, something like that. But about the invisible audience within who are looking at your documentation, and that it might not be developers, and how you can. I talked in there about some ways, like at Zapier, we just kind of looked at the numbers of like who is visiting here and which of these platform options are they taking, and we tried a bunch of things thinking that it was a developer audience, and that audience just always went for the less developer tool. We had a CLI, so do your development the way you do, like all command line, make it happen, and then a visual builder, which is more in line with the rest of Zapier, right? So part of that is how did people see Zapier, and they saw Zapier as a visual tool place. But I think if the audience had been true, like want to spend their lives on command line developers, they still, even though Zapier is a visual tool, they still would have gravitated toward that CLI. But over time, we found that they were not. And I mean, I think you can see it in the platform product now at Zapier that points more toward a visual platform tool that's a lot more similar to the user-facing tool that Zapier has also. So
that's a good point.
To find our way back to where your question was, is you have to know who that audience is before you kind of know where to go to work with them and to promote to them. And so if it is a developer audience, I mean, I think some of those places, Hacker News, particular subreddits can work. I really think it's important, if you're going to go to a community like that you are part of the community. That was a mistake that where I ran DevRel at a database as a service, and we produced a lot of content around sort of getting started kind of examples, and specifically around Node. And there was a time where we were publishing things really often and promoting them to the same places, and saw the not just a ban but a shadow ban where you don't know that you have been banned. It was someone on my team who was really prolific with the examples, which was awesome, but we recognized that we needed to find a better way to, a more authentic way to be able to promote to that community, that it was sort of oversaturated when there were new things every day, right?
Do you have any tips for people who are looking to join the communities they might be serving? I know a lot of founders maybe were on the periphery and lurking, but not really participating. What's the best way to get in without seeming self-promotional?
I think taking the steps to go beyond lurking is an important step. So take part in other discussions for sure. But I think also one of the things we haven't touched on that maybe people have got a feel for is kind of the overarching philosophy. When I said don't write about the product, write about the problem, I think you can take that philosophy across everything you do. And so in terms of communicating with these, participating in these communities, it's how can you bring the knowledge you have, I mean, that you clearly do because you started this company or you joined this early stage company, and how can you focus on really helping those people? And it might be that your product is in there somewhere, but I think the best content that you can create really gets at the problem without having your product front and center. So how can you solve? I wrote a post called the developer content mind trick that goes into this. And it's really how can you go, like how far can you go just trying to address this thing that someone would do to basically build it on their own. So developer, that's naturally going to be the place that they gravitate toward. It's like, oh, here's a problem, I can solve it, I can write the code. Yeah. And so, help them really see all of the things that they would need to do. And there's often edge cases that someone who's just getting into it hasn't thought of. Those edge cases, you lived those edge cases, you can help them see what those edge cases are. And some portion of those people are going to go and build it themselves. And that's okay, because they probably were going to do that in the first place. Yeah. But a bunch of them are going to realize, this person who's explaining this is the expert on this, and they've thought through all the edge cases, and look, I can just use their tool to be able to do this. And so I think you can take that. So in the same way that you can do that with content, you can do that in virtual communities. When we're back at developer events, you can do that there. I mean, it's really the DevRel approach of really trying to help someone, help the developer wherever they are on whatever they need, right? And you're doing it in the name of the company that you're a part of, which is at minimum going to be goodwill, but should in a long enough scale result in people that trust you enough to try and use your product too.
Yeah. I want to push a little further on this. I feel like in the happy case where you're both the founder and you've been through this problem and you're great at writing, this is super easy. But say you're a founder and you'd rather be writing code than writing a bunch of prose, or if you're on a larger team and you weren't the founder and maybe you weren't a developer before joining in this role, how does that role change in those cases?
Yeah, the not a developer role is that's often who I'm working with, and so a lot of the teams that I work with I'm working with marketers who probably are not the founders or don't have the backgrounds in that, and that's I mean. A lot of what we provide, every developer provides, is helping them to be able to hit that authentic mark with the content that doesn't sort of seem markety. And so it's a hard one to go when you don't know the technology behind it. That's like, I have a lot of empathy for those who are in that role, because I've said share knowledge, not features, in the past about sort of like those announcements that I would see at Programmable Web were all about sharing the features, right? And I mean, really, I'm talking about benefits versus features, which every marketer is like, of course, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that people who don't know the technology have to gravitate toward the features, because that's the way that you start to understand it. Mm. And it's harder to push through that to the other side where you really understand how that works. So I think being able to talk to people who do understand that, the why behind those features. So that would be the founders or early technical employees, users for sure. So I mean, yeah, or developers, right? Being able to have those conversations and be able to understand it. So I think someone who does have the communications side, but hasn't applied it to this technical problem before, I think they can use the same skills they've used to get there, but just acknowledge that it might be harder.
Yeah.
For a founder who would rather be writing code than writing prose, it's I get that problem too. I think the thing about developer content or any content is it takes a long time and takes consistency. And so, it's you're going for something that is planting seeds to sprout in the future, right? As opposed to something that is going to have those immediate results. You can see the immediate results behind the code that you write. So, but it's you have to start investing in it, and so being able to set aside some amount of time to do that is important. Some ways that you can make that a little easier, maybe you could. So let's take those two people that we've talked about. Let's just assume they're both in the same company. So you have the marketer without the background and the founder with it, to be able to pair and do kind of the brain dump, and then from the subject matter expert, and be able to put that together into some prose. So helping each other in that way. And it might take a few times, and you might, miss the mark the first time, but that's one way to be able to kind of solve both problems at once. It's still time consuming, but hopefully less so than, often an engineer writing a post. Engineers are very thorough and make sure that that everything is right, and so can spend a lot of time polishing something written to make sure that every little bit is right. And usually content doesn't need to have that level of perfection. We're not looking for the 5 nines on the uptime of our content.
I feel that pain though. Every time you make one tiny mistake, everyone makes a comment on it to be helpful. But definitely a thing.
A good one thing that's helped me to remember is that things that you publish can be edited in the future. So like, just as a reminder to yourself that yes, someone might catch it, and that's what I know that's the thinking behind it that you're wanting to avoid, but that can help especially in these early days where you're doing so many different things, to remember, like, let's get this out at 80% of where I know it could be, and we can always edit it later.
Any tips for remembering to go back and edit? Having been early stage and realized all of my documentation is horrifically out of date, is there a good way to avoid that?
Yeah, well, so there's documentation, and then there's other types of content. So on the other types of content, I find often when you think it's 80%, it's usually 95%. It's better than you think. And so you might not have to go back to that. On documentation, it's definitely an API. In the API space, like, I'm really big on automating what you can. I work with some companies that have tools that do this because I believe in it so much. So there's the open API specification. So if you have an API, for sure you should have that description. Whether you make that description public or not doesn't matter as much as being able to generate your reference, at least, from that. And so that piece will stay current as long as you make sure that when you make updates to the API, you also update the spec. And there are some tools that can test the spec against your actual API also. So you talk about that wanting to make sure something's perfect. And I recommended pushing it before it's absolute perfection with blog post type of stuff. But with I mean, with API references, it absolutely makes sense. Like, we have all been that developer who has been banging their head against something and realized that the way it said it works is not the way it works, right?
Yes.
So you want to, like, in order to get and maintain that trust with that developer audience, you want to make sure that your docs are accurate. So if there are ways to automatically test that, and like I said, in APIs, for sure, you can run those contract testing of this description against that, and then generating an API reference from a tested description means that part of it will be accurate. There's still, some going back to, other types of content around in your documentation around that. It goes like a lot of what, like, whenever I'm in documentation, it's that contextual, why does this matter type of content. The getting started guide. And if something changes in that, like, you wouldn't find it without knowing to do that. So, I mean, I think seeing your developer experience is something that you continually look at. And so, I mean, in terms of ways to do that, you can have someone whose job it is to do that. Or if you're not at a spot where someone can be dedicated to that, then it's the usual ways that you remember things, a task list or some sort of reminder system, right? To go back. I mean, if your docs are in GitHub, then there's probably some tools there around, like, the last touched date of a file that might be a way to bring some automation into that. I hadn't considered that before, but yeah.
That's a good idea. So before I open it up and let us go to questions, I want to end on the flip side. I guess we went there a little bit, but if there were 3 mistakes that everyone makes that if you could manage to get us not to make them as a result of this call, what would they be?
Yeah. I mean, I think we probably have touched on some of them, but the biggest thing I see, especially in the early days, is that inward focus. All of the blog posts are about releases or how to do this with our tool, and not thinking from the, like, what will someone else see? Like, we're going into their world where they don't know we exist yet. How will they see this before that? And I think even it's great to see velocity around product announcements, but you can even do that in a way that really gets at what was the problem that this new feature solved, right? So I think you can still have your sort of change log and do it in a way that helps people who haven't discovered you yet. And so, so turning that inward focus outward is the number one thing that I think there are problems that I see that I hope people who have been on this call, will not make. Then the other is the audience that we talked about quite a bit. Yeah. So I think giving yourself, every 6 month or maybe a shorter time frame, if you're even earlier, of kind of gut check of, like, is it developers that we're seeing? Because that can be, when you're making a dev tool, that can be a blind spot, as it was for me at Zapier. Of, is our developers the audience that this is really resonating with, that have the problem that we're solving? And sometimes it's not, even though it's still a developer tool that actually solves the problem. I mean, you can see it in Contentful is a great example of this, who started very developer focused, but I mean, if you go to their site now, it's heavily marketer focused because they realized that a content management system, the problem that it solved was for marketers more than developers, at least in terms of bringing it in. Solves a problem for developers too, because they're able to enable their teammates to make the changes that used to require code changes, perhaps, right? So, so you can still be a developer tool company that has an audience that is not. And so I think just double checking that from time to time. Then the third problem I would say is just, content can feel like such a big problem that you just decide not to do it at all, or maybe you don't decide, but it just happens. And so inconsistency in publishing is another thing that I see. And so, if your takeaway here is just like, how can we get one thing a month so that when someone arrives at our site and a developer is looking and wants to see, okay, are these people doing something? Are they,
Does this company
is this active,
still exist?
right? Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like that's look at that. They had a post last month and then they read it or even read the headline and they say like that like hits at a problem that I have, like, oh, wow, I should investigate this more. And I used to, when people asked how much should we publish, I would answer 2, and they'd look at me weird, and I'd say, well, how like, what's your question about? And often the timeline would be in the question. It would be like, how many times a month? And so I just now said 1. So I made it a little easier on that, but so maybe you shoot for the 2 a month, but if they're asking about weekly, then maybe they can do 2 in a week. And then, if you're asking quarterly or annually, I guess, try for those 2. But understand if you're doing 2 in a year, what it's going to look like, 5 months from the last one. And when a developer does that kind of sniff test on whether this company is really active, what that will look like. Yeah.
Okay. So just a reminder, we'll spend some time on questions. You can either drop them in the chat. I can read them out if you would like, or if you want to raise your hand from the reaction category, I can also let you ask Adam yourselves. While I wait for people to do that, Adam, thank you so much for this. A lot of what I took away was really, when you're starting to think about DevRel and content, it's all about the developers. And not necessarily what you want to be saying, but coming from that external perspective and saying, what problem are they trying to solve? And what's our point of view on that problem? Yeah. And then once you do that, it's all about the consistency and making sure that goes through the whole user journey.
Yeah. And, we talked a little bit about DevRel, which I think is definitely related here, and DevRel can be producing content. That was when I was at SendGrid. I really went in with the thought to help that DevRel team that was at that time traveling all over the world, doing events. How could we scale that with content? And nowadays, developers probably are developer relations is probably not traveling as much, but there's still some sort of efforts that they do that are less scalable but important. And so how can you sort of encourage, or if you're in DevRel, how can you take some of those efforts you're doing and be able to piece apart, find some content that can be published based on the live stream that you did, right? Like how can you beyond just put up a video and publish, like, are there other channels that you can reach, other ways you can use that? And really it's kind of scaling that same kind of dev focused approach. I mean, if you have DevRel at your company, like they understand the developer, and so the more you can get that voice into what you create, the better.
Cool. So we have a very specific question that came in. I like this question a lot.
All right.
I'm going to read it. We do a good job of creating blogs that resonate with the Hacker News audiences of the world. That's great. We get first read within our targets. However, conversion to the next action, a sign up, a click to the web page, seems low and is 3 to 7%. Any thoughts on the conversion percentage, ideas to help convert to a second action?
Yeah, well, I think that audience is naturally going to be less likely. That just because it's kind of a like check out what's new and move on. Like that's essentially the promise of Hacker News, right? Like, and so I think actually those percentages are, they don't sound bad to me for that audience. One thing to think of, if you're creating content that resonates with that crowd, then you'll often be getting that fast blip, that day of publication or day of promotion hit, but then it goes away. And so looking for ways to either have that same content that then speaks to keywords that someone will be searching over time, or be able to supplement that with types of content that has more of a long tail would be a way to increase those. So I don't know whether those topics are ones you could convert that way, but see that as like that's some awareness. They hear about us once, but these are some other ways we're going to show up on their radar. Other things I've seen people do with content are to run ads around it. So rather than running ads to a landing page and sort of a classic, like I'm going to get your email and whatever I can get from you sort of marketing move, it's how can we get someone to see the problem focused content? So if the problem focused content is not resonating, not getting the upvotes on Hacker News, could you retarget to make sure that some portion of those people then see the problem focused content? And you could also put those calls to action within that post that is resonating with that crowd. Often in the first couple paragraphs, if you can have a nice juicy link to something that really resonates with that problem, that maybe your post is a little more kind of current events, like geared toward like someone who's paying attention to the now, how do they get here? But if you can put some call outs to more evergreen problem type of content and do that early, then you might be able to get more people to take that next step. Couple ideas there.
I like those ideas. We have another question from Javi on if you could comment on the mix of video compared to text for building out developer content and communications, and then maximizing content impact through reuse or resizing.
Yeah. So video is not something I do a lot of. So, I definitely come from sort of that text content kind of background. So I don't have a lot to say on kind of the resizing, but on using in multiple ways for sure. Like, so videos definitely do resonate. They also are a different kind of consumption, right? They're a more engaged consumption, like everyone now who is watching us, but are less likely to. The downside is that they're a fully engaged sort of consumption. So I think you have a better chance with written content at getting developer attention long term. And so then finding ways to be able to, if if you have someone who's good at video, like absolutely continue that. But finding ways to repurpose in written form. So can you get a transcript of that and give it some light editing? Like you want to take out make it seem like a post, and some of the ways be able to add in some subheadings like that's so how can you translate that to the reader type of content? So people skim, so they look for those headings, and how can you pull out headings that are really that draw people in? And then you could definitely then use those subheadings for sort of cutting the video into a shorter piece that's just that section also, and use that as a headline that then pulls in the video, so it can kind of be a machine that continues producing content from the one piece.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another reminder to everyone, if you are doing videos, make sure to caption them, both for accessibility reasons, and there are definitely a lot of developers who would kind of rather watch silently and read along.
Right, yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other immediate questions, which is good because we're about at time. So thank you again all for joining us today. We're going to be doing more of this in the future. So if you have any requests for topics that you want to get into, either additional questions about content strategy and developer marketing or anything else about what you're working on, let Natalie or I know, and we would be happy to continue to set things up. And thank you again, Adam, for joining us today.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone.
Do you want to let everyone know how to contact you if they would like?
Adam D on Twitter or everydeveloper.com.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.